Hello viewers, welcome to MOOC's online course on visual perception and art, a survey across the cultures. This is the 20th and last lecture of this course, and in this lecture we'll be looking at how contemporary art has not only challenged our visual perception but made even looking very difficult, looking in the sense of looking at a work of art, looking at a sculpture, looking at a painting, because in the first place a number of examples of contemporary art activities or contemporary artistic products do not believe in art object anymore, A, and B, many of them do not involve only visual perception, because they introduce sound, they introduce specific kind of location, they introduce different non-artistic materials to address an idea. So it's not that only our visual perception gets challenged, it is also about what are the other perceptions that we need to include within the purview of visual perception if we are to address or at least understand or look at contemporary art of certain kinds. Now, contemporary art challenge the notion of visual perception in many ways. The visuality in contemporary art itself is more solely dependent on visual perception. To a great extent, it involves conceptual ideas, intellectual experiences which are far beyond any visual perceptions, yet many contemporary art affect our visual perception only. So, in other words, if we look at it from the point of view of visual perception, actually the visuality that we see in contemporary art is no more about only visual perception. It is actually more about ideas, it is more about intellectual experiences. But on the other hand, it has deeply impressed our visual perception. And most importantly, the contemporary art does not refer to simply painting or sculpture only. So the looking becomes a difficult process now. The looking is not only it has become a very difficult process, but looking itself is in crisis, because you are not only supposed to look, you are also supposed to hear, you are also supposed to read, you are also supposed to think while you are looking at something. Now, contemporary art tends to use various kinds of non-conventional and unusual materials to create artworks or make visual statements to convey an idea. So this is another important aspect that one has to make sense of, these unconventional materials that a contemporary artist is using. So clearly there is a shift of idea from representation to idea, from representation to concept, or you can also say it the other way around, from narrative to concept. Now, one of the biggest challenges faced by our visual perception in the wake of contemporary art is the use of unconventional materials, I just told you. Now, that includes mundane materials, found objects, industrial scraps, discarded objects, even the real space, and even highly technologically driven mediums. For example, when you look at this painting which is there right on your screen now, looks like an abstract painting, but actually it is not a painting, it is a photograph of assemblage, and only when you look at them very close you realize it is a whole heap of discarded mobile phones. So this kind of artwork has a name for itself, it is called junk art or junk sculpture. Now, never before modern art has anybody tried to use junk. Of course, we have seen in early modern art artists like Picasso using scrap material, but not exactly junk, not exactly things which people have discarded once and for all. Now, conceptually we can understand the purpose of making such a junk sculpture, because it is connected to an eco-friendly concern, it is connected to environmental concerns. But at the same time, how do you look at it? First of all, because the visual perception that is generally used to understand, enjoy and appreciate a work of art is mostly about representation. Now, if you said this is also a representation of an idea of a decay, of a discarded material, of the whole state that now our world is full of such discarded junks. So, art cannot be kind of pretending, cannot pretend as something that is very beautiful and soothing, because the world around has become a complete junkyard. So, when thinking about these things, these ideas, we can make sense of it, but then by going through this thinking, we have already informed our visual perception to accept this kind of work as a work of art. So, when you look at these photographs very closely, what looks like an abstract pattern, almost like a Jackson Pollock painting from distance, it kind of exposes itself to a terrible kind of situation of modern life, which is nothing but a world that is full of junks and discarded objects like this. So, when artists began using this kind of junks and scraps to create artworks, then sometimes it is difficult to even use the term artwork, because when you see this kind of works in progress or in its final stage, you can also feel that it is less about art per se, and it is more about a very strong visual statement in association with a specific concern. So, those junk sculptures or compositions that we have just seen are certainly a visual statement about a very specific concern. So is this. Now, it is also true that contemporary art practices like installation art, video art, new media art have challenged and redefined visual perception in significant ways. One of the major factors that affected our way of looking at art is the introduction of real time as an essential part of a work of art, particularly when you are looking at video art, when you are looking at an ongoing installation, when you are looking at new media art where things are moving or moving images being displayed, and when you are looking at a work of art not as something static anymore, but something that is continuously in progress, which is very different from the kind of visual perception we have when we look at sculpture or painting as a fixed static object. But here we are looking at sculpture and painting. We are actually not looking at sculpture and painting, we are looking at certain artistic processes which are always in motion. So, the visual perception ceases to remain exclusive to visual signals only when it encounters this kind of works, because one has to, as a viewer, one has to take care of the auditory signals, one has to take care of the sounds that these works are emitting, one has to take care of the texts that are running through these works of art, because all these things make a contemporary art very contemporary in many sense of the term. So, just to have an idea, now let us look at a short clipping from a video art and because that can illustrate the point that I am trying to make, particularly when you see that unless you put it on pause, you can't see anything more than a fraction of a second. A and B, you do not know what this video art is actually expressing or interpreting. Maybe it is neither expressing nor interpreting. It is could be an experiment with the new possibilities of this new media. Now, let us look at the video, then we will come back to the lecture. Now, having seen this, for a moment let us get back to the history. Way back in 1921, American artist who later settled in Paris, Man Ray, made this work called The Gift. The entire work is made up of ready-made objects or materials. The work does not represent any object, though the font clearly suggests a flat iron. So, the work object represents an idea, A, and B, the fact that the artist has not made or created anything by himself. He has only picked up the ready-made objects from around, or maybe shop, or from industry and factory, and used it in a way so that it becomes, if not a work of art, but a new visual statement, a new visual communication. And this is what many of these artists, whether it is Man Ray or Marcel Duchamp, they were thinking about. Rather than representing or expressing, they were thinking about making a very strong visual comment, a visual statement on an idea or on a concern or on a particular issue. Now, when Marcel Duchamp way back in 1930 uses a bicycle wheel and keeps it moving during the exhibition, then again people in general and our visual perception in particular were in a fix. I mean, because none of the elements that you see here is made by the artist himself. Here you do not see a work that is manually made by an artist. He simply collected the bicycle, he put a motor, he is getting it moving and rotating all the while, and he just got it fixed on the top surface of a stool. So, the art is something that an artist makes by her or his hand, is not an issue here. So, this is what our visual perception is habituated with, and this is what our visual perception fails to find here. So, again it needs a major kind of overhauling and transformation now. So, to challenge accepted notions of art, what Duchamp selected was mass produced, often functional objects from everyday life for his artworks, which he called ready-mades. He did this to shift viewers' engagement with a work of art from what he called the retinal, there to please the eye, to the intellectual, in the service of the mind. Now, if visual perception is understood to be entirely a retinal thing, then of course, when we encounter works by Duchamp or Man Ray, we have our visual perception has no function there. But probably because Duchamp was aware of the fact that even visual perception is also somewhere engaged with cerebral operation and intellectual kind of engagement. So, instead of using the term visual perception here, he uses the term retinal. So, this is what he wants to do to engage the viewers with the intellectual aspects of a work of art rather than the retinal, and by doing so Duchamp subverted the traditional notion that beauty is a defining characteristic of art. No, beauty is not a defining characteristic of art anymore. That has already been established also by constructivists and many other artists, and by using these non-conventional materials and methods and mediums, Duchamp is further establishing this idea that art is no more about beauty, it is about visual statement, it is about the materials, it is about the techniques, it is about the more intellectual concerns. Now, the first now lost kind of object thus made was made in 1913, almost 40 years earlier, because the materials Duchamp selected to be ready-mades were mass produced. He did not consider any ready-made to be original. Now, this is another very crucial thing for our understanding of art, because as far as our understanding of art is concerned, we know one work of art exists as a unique piece in the world. You do not have two Mona Lisas, right? You do not have two Ajanta paintings. You have one set of Ajanta paintings or one Mona Lisa. But now in contemporary art, from way back in 1919, early 20th century, some of these people like Duchamp and Man Ray, since they were working with ready-mades, so it naturally suggests that that work of art can again be made, because you are working with ready-mades, industrial product, you are not making it by your hand. And because of this possibility, now that there is possibility of making this work again, so the idea of original work is completely irrelevant now. But the kind of visual perception with which we have been looking at a work of art so far, we always knew that a particular work of art can be made only once in one lifetime. If you repeat that, it can only be a copy, but original will remain original. And so there is the whole kind of interest and a faith in the originality or the original piece of a work of art. But Duchamp completely brushes away all those ideas, and what Duchamp said about bicycle wheel was also interesting, because he said that in 1913 I had the happy idea to fasten a bicycle wheel to a kitchen stool and just watch it turn. So the whole idea is to watch it turn. So bicycle wheel is a kinetic sculpture that depends on motion for effect. Although Duchamp selected items for his ready-mades without regard to the so-called beauty, he said to see that wheel turning was very soothing, it was very comforting. I enjoyed looking at it, just as I enjoy looking at the flames dancing in a fireplace. So he is certainly investing certain notion of beauty and visual pleasure even in this sculpture, which is nothing but a bicycle wheel. So by encouraging viewers to spin the bicycle wheel, Duchamp challenged the common expectation that works of art should not be touched. So this is also interesting. A work of art should be only visually perceived, visually seen, and visually made sense of. But here Duchamp is actually inviting the viewers to touch the wheel and to rotate the wheel, to move the wheel. So it is not about visual perception only as far as this work is concerned. It is about touching and making the artwork in a certain way. So what kind of visual perception then we need, or what kind of changes we need in our visual perception to accept this kind of experiments, or for that matter this one, the very famous sculpture by Marcel Duchamp, which is called Fountain, made in 1917, and it is no sculpture at all because it is simply an industrially available and a factory made porcelain urinal kept upside down. But then we have somebody like Picasso who also created, and he loved to create an ambiguity between material and representation. So there is a sculpture which also looks like an object. For example, this bull which he made in 1942, but when you say he made in 1942, then immediately comes the question that did he actually make it or he simply assembled it? Because what you see here, there is not a single element which Picasso made by his hand. He used a bicycle seat and he used a bicycle handle, but placed them and juxtaposed them in such a way that it looks like a bull head. So again, it is not the handmade product that has any role to play here, but it is the idea, it is the intelligence that the moment, and it is also an artistic kind of ability to see things which are not there. Nobody would ever see the head of a bull in a bicycle seat, but Picasso saw that, and Picasso also saw that if he could place the handlebar of the same cycle with the cycle seat attached to it in a certain way, it might look a bull's head with a pair of horns. So there is an artistic intervention, a very aggressive intervention in a way that a new kind of visual perception begins to emerge. And that in fact prepares us also to accept this kind of works where you do not find anything hand painted, but full of materials, elements collected from the market, like this work or this work. So where then is the artist's involvement? Of course, there is a visual perception, a visual idea to envisage, to be able to imagine a work of art like this. And there is also a great faith and ability to see one's own idea in the industrial and commercial objects like this, which are very mundane, very common, and often aesthetically also not very refined. But after one is able to imagine the possibility of using them in a certain way, then it is definitely it begins to assume, it definitely begins to assume not only meaning, but begins to assume an intellectual life. Or for that matter, this one, again a ready-made object, but turned into a work of art in the form of a visual statement. Now, visual perception may get considerably meaningful and socio-culturally informed even in a painting like this. It is the meaning or the content of the painting that alters our visual perception. So, what we look at in this painting here is of course the figure of a human being. Then immediately we notice that this figure, the anatomy of this figure is made up of various kinds of commercial brands and nothing is. So, this figure is actually a consumer. I mean, so this very hint that what you think is a normal human being, his or her identity has turned into a consumer, a kind of impulsive and unstoppable consumer of this new market economy. And we also have what we call public art. Public art in public space can be found all over the world, and there you will see that not only the visual perception of the space changes, the very ability of the artists to turn materials into visually viable elements or shapes, and also the ability of the artists to see or imagine a place transforming itself into something completely new. Now, this gives a real jolt to the viewers, and it changes the landscape of that place, and it also changes our visual memory, visual perception of a place, and particularly when in this work by Christo, which is famously known as the Valley Curtain, which he made in 1972, kind of covering a huge valley across with curtains. And it was difficult in the beginning for viewers to accept it, or to also know how they would take this work, why it should be called a work of art, why a work of art has to obstruct the natural landscape of a place. But nevertheless, Christo went on with these projects, and he could actually demonstrate that it is possible, even if it is for a temporary period of time, to change and alter the visual perception of an entire real space with these artistic interventions. Like when he covers the Reichstag in Berlin, this huge government building, state building, with polythene all over, and he kept it there for a few days. You can well imagine that how the visual perception of not only the architecture, historically very important architecture, but also the visual perception of the whole place, and also the visual perception of the meaning of an architecture changes considerably in the mind of the viewers. So, when one installs, like Alexander Calder, a kinetic sculpture in an urban landscape which is supposed to rotate and move continuously, so what you see here is not only a static object, but an object that is moving, that is rotating, and this very rotation and movement creates different kinds of visual surprises every moment. So, then we train our visual perception also to expect surprises, also to expect unpredictability, also to expect something very new which it has not seen before. So, surprises and unpredictability, which is very much a part and parcel of contemporary art ideas, has to be negotiated with by our visual perception in a very big way, in a very significant way. Otherwise, what apparently looks like a very funny thing can actually turn into a very meaningful experience when we look at an outdoor installation like this, or this, or this. A simple kind of figure kept right on top of a tree, and you know very well that it is a handmade product, figure of an animal, of a monkey in this case, but the very placement, and that too not within the ambience of a gallery of an exhibition room, but in a natural space like on the top of a tree, or like this construction or a structure made out of twigs can change the entire vision of the landscape. And this is a very interesting work where the artist simply hangs a mirror on the tree, and the immediately mirror begins to reflect the space behind, and thereby expanding the idea of the space. Literally, of course, the space is not expanding, it is only the mirror view of the space behind, but it continuously creates an illusion of a large expanding space. And then there is a constant struggle on our part with our visual perception to negotiate this experience in a given space. And then there are some interesting issues with regard to public art, which are also pertinent to the practice of contemporary art. For example, when a public art is permanently installed in a specific site, which is called site specific sculptures, then we need to accept that as a happening that has permanently changed the look or appearance of the space. Now, public art often could be integrally related with nature and earth, and hence this kind of sculptures are subject to the changes in nature. We have come across various kinds of public arts which are also known as land art or earth art, which is subject to decay. They disappear, they decay, they disintegrate like the natural objects. Hence, temporariness of works of art and temporary works made for a limited period of time has also become a very important idea in the contemporary art and also in the realm of public art, because non-permanent mediums are often used intentionally to ensure its short life. Now, deliberately made non-permanent public art and contemporary art is of course there. So, sculptures thus made are left to decay, disintegrate and disappear eventually. Then a large part of contemporary art is also about installations. I mean, that work of art cannot be experienced unless it is installed, and very complicated and complex installations are there in contemporary art. Right after this, we will look at a clipping of a video of a Frieze art fair which takes place in London, and this is a video from one of those previous Frieze art fairs, and even this short clipping reveals that most of the contemporary artworks are so much about installation that the moment that work of art is taken out from the gallery, it ceases to exist. Not only that it has to be installed somewhere, but it requires so much of gadgets, these works require so much of technologies and technical devices that you simply can't leave it as a work of art in your studio, in your room. What you get back after the show is over is a box full of scraps and junks which you need to reassemble again if you are to show it to some other people at some other place. And it also makes, which Duchamp had already experimented with his bicycle wheel when he asked his viewers to touch, that many contemporary artworks and public art could be interactive, it could be playful, it could be light-hearted also, to engage the public without any conceptual baggage. By and large, many contemporary art want to engage the public. They don't want the public or the viewers to simply look at their works. They want them to become a part of their work in some way. So, simple visual perception is not going to help. Visual perception at its basic level is always required, but then we need to mature that in order to make sense of what contemporary art is trying to do. Now, after this lecture, immediately after this lecture, we will be looking at a small video clipping from this Frieze art show, which is highly contemporary in nature, and there you will hardly come across any single painting or sculpture. Mostly you will see artworks which are either installation in nature, or it is moving, or it is very much gadget driven, and most of these artworks require a different kind of engagement on part of the viewers, not just to be perceived visually, but to be perceived by awakening all the possible senses that we carry. Thank you.
c'est un jeune artiste aussi.